Perfect. Yes, as I was saying before, some of you joined. I think there's a lot of things going around at the moment because quite a few people have let us know that they can't make it live, but they want to listen to the recording. So that's why I was just making sure I pressed the record button before we make a proper start. But it's absolutely lovely to have colleagues here. This is the third in this series of debates. And after I've just finished speaking and handed over to Chris, I will pop the link in the chat to the articles and videos from the first two in case anyone wants to catch up after this session. It's an absolute pleasure running these, and it's nice to be able to take a kind of a step back from the kind of detailed questions of implementation to tackle some of the kind of bigger questions, something I never had a luxury of doing when I was working in the policy side of things. And it's really nice to see how welcomed these debates have been, not just by academic and researcher colleagues, but also by lots of colleagues who work on the policy side in DFE and IFATE and ETF, and by practitioners as well. So it feels like it's kind of united those three important groups in taking that step back and thinking about some of the kind of broader issues. So I'm delighted, as always, to welcome Chris Winch to chair this session. So Chris, perhaps I could just hand over to you to say a little bit about what we've been discussing so far on the topic for today.
Thank you, Ollie. Yes, these principles debates have now been running for around 5 years, I think, and I think we're on our 5th series. The original idea was to take a closer look at some of the conceptual foundations of VET in England and how debates on these foundations connected with policy issues. And initially, we dealt with some of the broader topics, like what is VET for, who is it for, what are the aims, and so on. In subsequent years, we've narrowed down our focus to more specific issues. And I think this is part of the reason why we continue to run them with such interest. As Ollie pointed out, they are interesting to policymakers because they introduce perspectives that maybe get overlooked in the hurly-burly of everyday policy discussion. And this final series has been dealing with some really quite particular but quite chunky issues as well, I think, like the breadth or narrowness of vocational education, or what is exactly the nature of apprenticeships. And now we're going to look at one which I think is very interesting from both an ethical and a political point of view, but it also sits right at the center of debates about national policy, and in particular debates about levelling up and regional policy. And we're talking today about the issue of how VET policy takes into account national needs and priorities, while at the same time taking account of regional and local needs, and the tension between these and the possible productive tension that may arise from them. So we're looking, therefore, at whether or not regional, local and national level policy can be better coordinated. Who are the various interested parties, national, metropolitan, local governments, and also social partners like colleges and training providers, trade unions, employer associations and enterprises, and indeed local communities. So that's our topic for today, and I very much look forward to the discussion that we've been promised. So I think it's probably time to start, and we're starting with opening provocations from various speakers. We've got Kevin Orr from Huddersfield, Norman Crowther and Maurice Glasman, Vivica Lindberg from Stockholm, and Leslie Powell from Nelson Mandela University, South Africa. So Kevin, if it's okay, I'll hand over to you to start the whole proceedings off.
Thank you, Chris, and good afternoon, colleagues. So for my provocation, I will focus on Greater Manchester Combined Authority, which already has devolved power over the adult education budget and which is actively seeking control over vocational education and training for 16 to 19-year-olds, including T-levels. And I am posing the question, in this instance, is local organisation of VET, of vocational education and training, better? And my answer is, well, maybe. Let me set out how I have come to that equivocal conclusion. And I should say that in preparing this, I've been particularly influenced by a paper written by Lorna Unwin and Ruth Lupton in 2018 about GMCA's devolved powers, that's Greater Manchester Combined Authority's devolved powers. So I'll mention the social and economic problems that Manchester faces, the ideas that shape policymakers' thinking, and some other technical and ethical issues that arise from this question of localism in relation to VET. But let me start with Manchester's diversity. Greater Manchester has an economy that is larger than that of Wales, and it has been described as England in miniature. Andy Burnham, who is the mayor of Greater Manchester, has described the city's very own north-south divide. And certainly the city centre of burgeoning high-rise steel and glass is very different from the city that I moved to as a teenager in the 1980s. As a skint student, I used to shop at Charlie Ball's discount store behind the old Marks and Spencer. Where was then Charlie Ball's discount store is now Harvey Nichols' department store, which is a motif for the transformation of the city centre. But yet, a short walk north from Harvey Nichols to somewhere like Collyhurst, a matter of 25 minutes walk, reveals just how little parts of the city have changed in the past few decades. Poorly maintained housing, empty brownfield spaces and boarded up shops are not hard to find. So the borough of Manchester, the city of Manchester, has many very deprived areas, and that is even before you take the tram to outlying areas like Oldham and Rochdale. So no simple skilled solution will meet the needs of the whole city region's economy or people. That said, although Greater Manchester's economy fares worse on average than in the country as a whole, it fares well in comparison to other city regions outside London. And in all education phases under 19, Manchester fares better than all other city regions, again, apart from London. Yes, there is a larger gap in the proportion of working age adults qualified to NVQ level 4 and above than nationally. It's 35% in Manchester against just over 38% nationally. But the central problem here is not the relative weakness of Manchester's economy or people's levels of skill in Manchester in relation to those of England or the UK. The problem lies in those weaknesses in the whole of the UK. So Manchester's comparison should be with Barcelona and Munich, not Birmingham and Newcastle. As Ruth Lupton and Lorna Unwin put it, a city region seriously concerned with transformation needs to raise its sights beyond the national average and begin to address some of the problems that are common to the English system and holding Greater Manchester back from the achievement of its ambitious economic and social objectives. So the problems of Manchester are those of England in miniature, at least in relation to VET. They include the stark division of academic and vocational pathways at 16 and 19, the lack of employer-led work-based training, the emphasis on initial and not later or continuing skills development, and again, to quote Lupton and Unwin, the propensity of the school system to reproduce rather than overcome socioeconomic inequalities. The point I'm making is this: local policymakers must not just try to make the present system work a bit better. The entire system needs altering. Now, can that be better achieved at local level? Well, I would argue only if two things happen. First of all, if combined authorities are genuinely freed up from some existing national policy. About half of 16 to 19 provision is currently statutory, for example. An example of that is the GCSE resits in maths and English. But more importantly, only if different thinking is applied. Many policymakers, local and national, are still in thrall to a kind of reductive interpretation of human capital theory that anticipates more skilled workers, leading to more skilled jobs, eventually leading to greater productivity. That has led to policies that emphasize and reward colleges and training organizations for learner numbers, regardless of the demand for the eventual skills and qualifications of those learners. Instead, the problem in Manchester, as in the rest of the UK, is that there are so many low-paid jobs that demand few skills. And that is what is holding back skills development. Lack of jobs that require skills is the issue, not lack of skills per se. Now, of course, there are exceptions to this. I'm painting with a broad brush. Employers need to incentivize skills development by investing in their businesses and consequently in the creation of skilled jobs. Now, arguably, that might be better encouraged politically at a local level. There are other relevant matters which are ethical. Local democracy, who makes the decisions about skills and training, and in the interests of whom? How is success measured? Who benefits from skills development and any related economic growth? Indeed, I would say that perceiving education in purely economic terms has arguably already led to a narrowing of the curriculum and the marginalisation of other forms of adult education in Greater Manchester. And there are technical matters too. All of this devolution might only mean greater fragmentation of the national skills sector, and there will be inevitable border issues for individuals and organisations living or operating within different jurisdictions. So to begin to bring this to a conclusion, the key is not just localism in relation to VET. It is about good decisions with clear accountability to local communities. So my final words to conclude where I started: is the local organisation of VET better? Well, maybe.
Thank you very much indeed, Kevin. You've managed to cram in an enormous number of thoughts and covered an enormous number of topics in a very short time. So you've certainly provoked us. So we move on now to Norman Crowther from the NEU. Over to you, Norman.
Thanks, Chris. I think some of my points will follow on from Kevin's, but with a different vocabulary. The main concern, I think, is that the inevitable one of being on the hamster wheel or the Groundhog Day, whichever you prefer. But looking at what I was trying to focus on in this provocation, and what I want to move to is that there needs to be, I believe, and I think that this is the work that I've done with Mark and Chris, is that we're looking for a development of mediating institutions for education skills. So it has to be a question about how colleges are those sorts of mediating institutions and what it is that's needed to have mediating institutions. And if we begin then, on the hamster wheel, in 2005, Foster's report said two things in his summary, which I think is entirely relevant today. He said, incorporation liberated the individual college, but failed to provide a basis for locality strategy. I believe that's still the case, almost 25 years later. And he says, but above all, FE lacks a clearly recognised and shared core purpose. And since then, those issues, I think, have been exacerbated by a number of contradictory premises, which we find when we look at the FE system in England. The sector has had a decline in funding since that time, that its range of innovation in terms of what it's seeking to provide has become arguably greater. For example, international development is still on the table for lots of colleges if they could so pursue it. And what we've seen since then, which has increased to a more radical level, is that college mergers and demergers are reshaping college identities. So we're now moving into an era of super college groups, as well as colleges demerging. And finally, the policy change continues to promise to deal with these contradictory tensions, but simply arguably adds to those tensions. So to look at the issue then of what could a college do now, what is the situation in reality, apart from looking at the colleges as institutions and reviewing the system, which I think is needed, to be fair, because these questions are so fundamental. if we take it in turn as to what would a mediating institution look like and how can we actually deal with the problems that Kevin's provocation has outlined, is that the first thing is that the college is an institution. What sort of institution is it? One of the shorthands today is that it's an anchor institution. But if it's an anchor institution, a college would then need to articulate a strategic understanding and identification of what it means to be an anchor institution. Unlike other anchor institutions, it hasn't got a history that has got an established social worth attached to it, such as hospitals or universities. It needs to create that position. So it needs an articulated strategic understanding. Whether it could do it without government support is obviously extremely contestable. But if it is to fulfill that role and to have a new civic purpose, it needs to engage with that sort of level of debate. Secondly, the college governance arrangements, arguably, if we wanted to engage with and promote a more mediating institution, that is one that is not simply a liberated individual college attempting to fight its way for funding, but wants to integrate into wider social and business life, then the argument would be to look at those systems which deliver that best, and they are social partnership systems. They are integrated. The other neoliberal economies such as Australia and America do not have that form of system. So it's no small ask to say that a college should attempt to be a mediating institution because of the background to the other industrial sectors and government views of trade unions. Currently, we're in that sort of situation where it looks further apart than ever before. But if we're to integrate, we need to have mediating institutions and a mediating ethos that enables that to happen. So the first thing would be to form a social partnership within the college with workforce trade unions and the wider trade union movement. Again, no small ask, but I don't believe we're talking about a small problem. We're talking about a problem that is endemic to the sector and has been for, as Sainsbury said, over 100 years. And the last point is that the college should aim to strategically foster better, clearer local, regional and national pathways for technical and skilled work. But I'm calling on that word strategy now. It needs to have a strategy in order to do that. And at the moment, I don't think colleges have got the space for that. I don't think they've got the leadership for that, for those constraining reasons before. And I don't think they've got the government support for that. But that doesn't mean that that shouldn't be done. In fact, it really gives some urgency and criticality to answering those questions. So thank you, Chris. That's my provocation.
Thank you very much, Norman. Again, another interesting perspective on the question, one that we want to return to, I'm sure. The issue of governance and regional and local coordination is something we want to consider. We've had two perspectives from England. We're very fortunate to have contributors from outside the UK to give us a somewhat different take on these issues. And I'm going to ask Vivica Lindberg from the University of Stockholm, first of all, to make her contribution. So over to you, Vivica.
Thank you so much. I've taken the freedom to make a PowerPoint with only a few slides to support what I'm saying, and I'll start with actually with from the local to the national, with a very short history of Swedish vocational education, and then making a very even shorter comparison to Finland. Apprenticeship was formally abandoned already in the 19th century, and schoolification by law came into effect from the 1980s, although you wouldn't understand it as schoolification as today. But then it was a question of shortage of skilled workers. shortly, only a few years after the schoolification, there was an economic recession. And of course, young people were those who were most vulnerable for unemployment. In the 30s, a concept that had been tried out in some regions, the workshop school, was taken as a political decision in order to solve the problem with youth unemployment, and similarly prepare a skilled workforce for coming better times. This went on until the 60s, when there was a national mapping of vocational education in Sweden, showing that there were approximately 600 different programs. They were different in duration and content. And the idea was that this couldn't be the case. We have to make them more comparable, and we have to, based on the issues like democracy and equity, the 1970 reform of upper secondary school decided to also integrate vocational programs. So based on this, you could see that 30 national programs with national curricula for each of them was developed. And from a regionally developed vocational education and training, you will find that the 1970s introduced the national development of vocational education and training. Taking Thomas Sie's words, he describes this kinds of process as the modernization of schooling, and compares it with modernization of production, which he says can be found already from the 1860s. So the schoolification is lags about 100 years after the productional development. If we look at Finland, I said even shorter. We have, in some ways, historical and societal similarities, but also big differences because of the time Finland belonged to Russia or Soviet Union as the young Soviet Union as a country. But the process is similar in that way that also in the 70s, when the Finns started to looking for first national compulsory school, they also started looking for the Swedish model for vocational education and training. So from also here, we found approximately 600 local and regional programs of different duration and content. The result resulted in 25 national VET programs in Finland. And this implementation took place during the 1980s. This is an economical issue. They didn't have the economy to change the system at once as in Sweden, but this was a longer period of time. And then I will make a big jump from the 70s and 80s to today, where my concern is that we cannot look only at local/regional versus national issues in relation to vocational education and training. We must also look into rural and urban issues, since they are quite different. The needs are different, and also the change of pace is different. So we have all these. I just put in a few words that contribute to the changing world of labor market, and thereby also to the changing demands for vocational education and training. We have these kinds of changes, labor market, where we can see that from long periods, you build up a relationship to your employer, and the employer also builds a relationship to you, which was valid when I was a kid, to today's idea of the employer as eager to stay and ready to go, as as was said already in the early 90s, we find societal changes coming, and we find also changing conceptions of work. For instance, Boninardi has already some years ago introduced the concept of micro work, when people can work during their lunch, for instance, doing work for Amazon or other big companies. So they get paid per minute they're working, while they are actually working with something else, so they can add on to their salaries. But however, the salaries in each case are small. And there are also changes in conceptions of responsibilities. Do you really have to be responsible to an employer that really wants you to leave as the project ends and you are on your own again? And then to this comes the idea of globalization, where also supranational institutions like CEDEFOP, UNICEF, OECD, and the EU all are contributing to changing the idea of what vocational education should provide workers with. So the policies, the national policies and decisions are made in the big cities. In the Nordic countries, that would be Helsinki, Stockholm, Copenhagen, and Oslo. And now also Brussels is part of that. And what they look for is mostly the urban conditions where many people live in one place, and then they take decisions about vocational education that is relevant for these people. But when you go to rural areas, the same curricula are valid for these people. So people who live in sparsely populated areas need to learn how to build big houses for Brussels or Helsinki or Stockholm, while they actually are building mostly small houses for 1 or 2 families. And very few of them actually will ever move or go to somewhere to Europe to work, but they still have to have the kind of competencies, whereas the need in these areas, based on the global or European demands, is that there are so many complex issues to be taken care of that nobody can have only one work. He has to have several works but only maybe 2 or 3 hours a day for one work, and then do something else for the rest of the times. And nobody has the competence that is really needed in the urban areas. So the communication between rural and urban becomes disturbed, because they talk from so different points of departure. That's my provocation. We have to take the differences also. We have to I can't find the words now. We have to look at the differences and take them into account when we start working for local, regional, national, or global. What does global really mean for most people? Who are the people that move, and who are the people that move less? And what does it mean? What does it mean for the rest of for those who actually move? I have some other issues that are not related to vocational education, but rather what happens to people who have been moving around the world as global workers when they retire. That is a bigger issue than for this session. So that was what I wanted to contribute with. So from the global and regional development of vocational education and training in relation to local needs, to a national and now a global development of vocational education and training. If you want me to say something about these big organizations, I can do that as well, but that could be for later.
Thank you very much indeed, Vivica. And you've reminded us of something very important, I think, that the sheer diversity of the regions of many, many countries. And you've made a useful contrast. We opened up with Kevin talking about Greater Manchester, which in some ways a suitable point of comparison would be other large metropolitan areas. But you've also pointed out to us that there are regions in various countries very different from these metropolitan areas. And that's the case in England as well, I think. So thank you very much for that. And we now move on to another perspective from outside England, which is Leslie Powell from Nelson Mandela University in the Republic of South Africa. Over to you, Leslie.
Hi. I'm going to pull up a presentation quickly. Let me just do that. There we go. Can you all see it?
Yes, thanks, Leslie.
Okay. Just to start off by saying thank you so much to the H Foundation. Oh, I need to actually slideshow it, don't I? Just give me a second. There we go. That's better. So just to say thank you so much to the H Foundation and Ollie for inviting me and including me and encouraging me also just to share this work. So my presentation today is going to have 3 provocations, and they all come from an article that I've done a few years back. And the article was called Planning for Freedom, From Human Capital to Human Capabilities. And it was really a critique of the dominance of the skills mismatch discourse that underpins the South African skills development system. And it was an attempt to map out what might be the dimensions of an emancipatory skills planning system. What are the bits that we need to think about, talk about, and include, and perhaps even flesh out. So I came at this work, well, initially I came at it from a political economy perspective, and then I came at it from working with young people who make their livelihoods, or partly are anyway, in the informal economy or the social economy, and drawing from across a range of projects, all of which had similar types of questions, just dealing with different cohorts. And they were all about trying to understand how young people who make their livelihoods in the informal economy are living, learning, working, and better understanding the ways in which our public TVET college system and our publicly funded VT can support the education and training needs of these people. And this is not a small question in our context. You know, the latest youth unemployment figures in the country puts us as way beyond 60% youth unemployment. This is shocking. And the vast majority are making bits of their livelihood, or all of their livelihood in the social economy or in the informal economy. So the paper maps out the theoretical basis for the thinking in much more detail. I used a capability approach, and I used the social ecosystem model, trying to pull the 2 of them together. Maybe just use what was important for me, and just to contextualize South Africa a little bit as I do this, was what is called the informational basis of judgment for justice in the capability approach. And it's really about what are the bits of information that we use to come to our understanding of, let's use the word skills need. It's a very policy word, and it's a very weak and fraught and problematic term, but let's use the term. What are the bits of information that we use, and how do we do that, and whose voices are included and excluded? So in South Africa, we spend a fortune, a bloody fortune actually, on our national skills development planning system, which consists of seaters, which consists of workplace facilitators. And the way it works is this: you have workplace skills plan developed at all workplaces of theoretically 50 plus employees, but more like 150 plus employees, because the 50 plus tend to not normally participate so well. This then goes up to the sector skills plan. It goes to the SETA, and they compile a sector skills plan. This then gets aggregated further, and it goes up into the national skills plan. And after spending a massive amount of money, we now have a national skills plan, which is not very useful for anything really, because you can't translate it into curriculum. It's too generic. We've started focusing on what we've called occupations in high demand rather than on skills necessarily, so we can maybe do something with it. And I'm not suggesting that all skills planning is just in this paper that we should just throw the baby and the bathwater out. It's useful to know, for example, that we are running short. We're not going to have enough early childhood educators, or that we as a country have actually got enough firemen, but we don't, the engines are all broken. So that's the problem. It's not actually a skills problem. These are useful bits to it, but it's so total, you know, this is the focus and this is the entire focus. And then this is not a neutral exercise, because it drives student funding, it drives all kinds of carrots that are then made available to try and push for certain skills that are seen as being in short supply. And there's so much error in the system anyway. In the paper, I draw on the capability of voice, which is just about expanding the processes for inclusion, educationally, politically, the capability of education, broader vision for the role of ET, and a broader understanding of the role that it might play in our social context. You know, the social ecosystem model is, for me, really a useful place to have some of this debate, and it's Hodgson and Spoor's work, so I think they should speak to their own work, really. But I found it really useful to think about the notion of collaborative horizontalities, or the radical horizontal, as Spurs has called it more recently, and facilitating verticalities, and the role that education institutions play as mediating anchor points in bringing together communities, institutions locally to be able to engage about what might be the education and training needs in relation to that regional economy and that particular community. So I'm talking in very broad terms, but there is an article, and one can pull that up if you want to look at it more. So the article maps out 6 dimensions of an emancipatory skills planning system, and like, these are not the only dimensions, they're not the only things that matter. And these dimensions it was really an opportunity to take the capabilities approach and to take the social ecosystem framework and look at our current system against those 2 systems and see where it brings us to. So 6 areas that this comparison was done, was mapped out: the goal, the purpose, the economy, the labor market, what we actually mean when we talk about education, training, skills, the methodology, how we actually begin to understand what we're responding to, why we're responding to it, and what Bonvin spoke about is the anthropological aspects, and the last bit was transformation. So I don't want to go through the whole paper, this is not the point here. So the first provocation is really, what might be the dimensions that we're thinking about? And I hear the tension between micro and macro, between local and regional and national, and it's a tension in South Africa as well. I mean, we've gone from a system that was a provincial competency to a system that's a national competency. It's always been a system that has been nationally examined with a national curriculum, and it's a system fraught with resource problems, financial problems, many challenges. And so in a way, a national curriculum has made a lot of sense. So we've got 2 national curricula, and then we have this interesting bit that's been fledgling, and it's been growing on the outskirts of it, which are skills and occupational programs. And this is the one area where colleges have room to kind of dance, you know. And we're currently doing a study on all of those to see what are they doing with this space. These are funded by the CETAs or by specific government departments, or maybe by local business. And so we're trying to understand how colleges are utilizing this room for maneuver, and we're finding some really interesting and incredible work taking place in those spaces. So that's the local and that's the national. And the way it's played itself out is that they just kind of happen in separate spaces, physically within the college, different managers, and also pedagogically quite distinct from each other as well. So in the paper, it kind of does this comparison, which I said I don't want to talk about now. I think you can have a look at it if you want to. I really want to zone into a few aspects. And the first is the relationship of education to skills planning. I use the term skills planning in this paper, and I know that some people, one of my colleagues was saying, why did you use the notion of skills planning? That's so narrow. But it's precisely because of the argument for a broader understanding of what we might mean by skills planning that I utilized that and made that argument in the work. So if you take our national skills planning system, the base assumption is that education and training institutions should be responsive to scarce and critical skills, and our occupations in high demand. If you take it from a capability approach, for example, it would be that education and training are central players in expanding the capability for voice, the capability to aspire, and for redressing adaptive preferences. And these are two very different ways of looking at this problem. And so I just want to zone into this for a little bit. One of the earlier speakers was talking about mediating institutions and the important role that higher education institutions, universities, vocational education and training institutions can play as mediating institutions. One of the critiques that's come up about this idea in Southern contexts has been that communities don't have the ability to participate. They don't have the voice to participate. They don't have the confidence to participate. They don't have the room in many cases to participate. We have many structures which includes many different voices, but they come into it in a representative democracy framework. And so it's not necessarily the voice of the most marginalized, the voice of our urban township youth, the voice of our rural communities are not necessarily present at these. And so expanding the ability for communities to participate in these discussions, in these dialogues, is absolutely critical, because if we don't, we're not going to be able to understand that, in fact, what we need to be working towards is building our fixed economy, for example, which is where the vast majority of our young people working in the informal economy work, building our care economy. We don't have enough carers. We don't have people looking after the young or the aged. Working out how we're going to work better with water within our communities, working out how we're going to deal with food sovereignty in our communities. Hunger is a very, very real issue. So our vocational education and training system can't just be about training engineers for the labor market. It can't just be about training people to work in an informal sector in large corporations, because jobs in large corporations have been dropping significantly since 1994. The biggest growth in job numbers has been in either the SMMEs or in the informal sector. So we need to find a different way to engage locally with these communities. I've used the term methodology, but it's probably much bigger than that. It's probably more about participation. Sorry, I'm also a little bit sick, so I'm going to be kind of coughing through the rest of this. And to begin, moving past a predictive information set. So our current system, we compile all of this. So industry submits the workplace skills plan, it gets to CETAs, they then compile it, eventually it becomes a national skills plan, and then decisions are made on what this might mean for spending. And it means you're always kind of looking a few years back. And I'm really not trying to oversimplify the complexity of curriculum or trying to ignore the knowledge basis of curriculum and the complexities around that. But I do think that opening up spaces within regions where communities can be involved and where communities can co-construct what the needs might be and why those are needs from their perspective really matters, because the policymakers, the educators, those of us who sit in universities, we don't necessarily understand the lived experience of the vast majority of our globe, actually. And particularly in our country, we don't necessarily understand the vast majority of our marginalized youth and how they're experiencing life and how they are actually working and what the real African economy looks like and how we might better respond to that. So moving away from this kind of deductivist causal kind of approach towards a more co-constructed and inductivist logic. And it's not about throwing skills planning out of the window. It's about building a regional model that allows for voice and that strengthens voice and that pulls that voice into it in a meaningful way. Oh, so there's a provocation at the bottom of the screen that let me have a look. So the provocation was institutions as mediating anchors and what this might mean educationally. What this means for TVET colleges, for example. What does empowerment mean? Because it can't just be when you're dealing with a cohort of learners who are extremely impoverished, who come from very marginalized communities. What does this mean for expanding voice? What does this mean for opening up spaces for dialogues between, serving as bridges, if you like, between the communities that you work with and communities of students that you work with and the policymakers who make the policies and frame this, what the skills needs of this area and this country might be. So the argument is really for a much broader sense of skills planning and of skills development, of acknowledging the importance of community voice and participation, of orientating towards a social transformation agenda, not simplistically towards narrow notions of employability, and really taking seriously moving beyond narrow human capital agendas and taking seriously the working, living and learning contexts that people are aspiring to work and live and learn in, and that they are actually working and living and learning in. And taking very seriously the need to build democratic systems, not simply representative democratic systems. And I think adopting a much broader notion of vocational education and training and the multiple roles that it might play in the global South and in the South African and African context. Of course, work in its broader sense, and beginning to try and understand what work is actually taking place and beginning to map urban townships, which workplaces are, which businesses really exist, because we haven't done that work well enough. And beginning to understand VET as being for social transformation and community development and human flourishing, and not just about profits, not about driving profit only, if at all, actually. So my last provocation is about the importance of expanding the capability for voice and the capability to aspire, and how critical this is for enabling civic engagement. And in this view, to begin thinking about VET and the knowledge and the skills that sit therein as not being simply reproductive or responsive, but potentially transformative. And I think that my main provocation is really about this importance of capability for voice. And it's not not a simplistic point that I'm making. It's a point that I think is fraught with complexities, as we know. But I think it's a point that the provocation that we need to begin unpacking what this might mean for vocational education and training in South Africa and on our continent and the global South, and perhaps in your context as well, which is also kind of, I've got my feet in kind of both contexts, so it's also my context, and maybe it's something we need to talk about. So thank you very much for listening. Thanks, Prof. Wenji.
Thank you very much indeed, Leslie, for that very rich presentation. And among the many topics that you covered, just a couple occurred to me: the importance of the informal economy, which we haven't yet considered. I think some of the problems with bottom-up aggregation of needs is another interesting matter. And last but not least, of course, the issue of voice and who gets to have a say in what happens in their localities. We have about 9 minutes available for discussion. So what I propose is that we have a general discussion at this point, and really it's a matter of leaving the floor open to people. So if you would like to jump in, please raise your electronic hand and we will try to accommodate you. Martin, I think you were first out of the blocks. You're mute.
Yeah, and I'm on mute because I'm so fast. Thinking before or acting before I thought, which is not unusual for me. Just two observations, great presentations and really thought-provoking. So thank you very much indeed, and just done their job as provocations. Is interesting, I think, from Kevin, immediately you're talking about the local organisation rather than the content. And I think back to the Whitehead review, which did talk about the ability to actually vary the content locally in order to meet particular needs of particular employers. So we've had a conversation about effectively the organisation and composition of the mix of skills rather than about the content of the actual teaching, having local dispensation. And I think there's still a conversation to have about the local dispensation and content of the actual courses themselves rather than the mix of courses. The other thing I think, with due respect to our colleagues from overseas, is that the geography matters in this in England. And I've commented before about the congested geography in England, which confounds neat lines on the map. And the question I think is always worth asking, who does the M6 corridor belong to, Merseyside or Greater Manchester? And who determines where learners go in those areas? So with the congested geography here, I think it puts another dimension over the local national dispensation and argues against too far a move towards local, though I accept that the absolute value of better local dispensation on the lines that Norman was talking about does argue, as Norman was suggesting, though, that local, ultra local mediation is through the college itself, which mediates between the local they understand and the national constraints and requirements. So actually, there's an argument that I think the local government layer there sometimes becomes between the local dispensation and the national dispensation in a potentially unhelpful way. I don't know if that's particularly helpful, but I think we just need to think about this in terms of content as well, and also take about the constraints of geography that apply in a very congested country like England in particular. And I think Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland is slightly different in this respect.
Thank you very much, Martin. Anyone else? No, Eddie, yes. You're muted.
Sorry, I lost my all the pictures rearranged themselves and I couldn't see where I was anymore. Yes, thanks very much, Chris. What a fantastic series of provocations, and I thought the way they flowed into each other was very interesting. I mean, it seems to me that before we worry about locating this at regional, sub-regional, national level, that I mean we are suffering from this dogma, which is that, as Kevin said, that the lack of high-skilled jobs can somehow be resolved by education. I think that is a belief which needs to be challenged, because it feels like it's shifting responsibility for economic difficulties onto education providers and even onto their students. But I think, as Leslie says, we do need to talk about skills shortages. We do need to talk about labour market needs, economic needs, of course, and I think, as Norman said, they need to be planned for in partnership with existing workers and future workers. I just wondered, I mean, if we're allowed a question, I just wanted to throw back at our speakers the question about what they think about this growing tendency that we have in England, anyway, to use labour market returns, labour market measures, which are very, very crude. I mean, we're just talking about pay levels, really, as a way of giving value to qualifications and courses. We now have the language of high value courses entering into use. So we're not even talking about skills for jobs. We're talking about, courses that correlate to high paying jobs. In other words, reducing the economic side of the piece to simply the current profile of jobs. I mean, in that kind of world, you know, where's the place for saying that, you know, we need to expand the care sector, that we need to develop caring jobs, which are, of course, you know, among the lowest paid. So I'd be quite interested in your views about that, because it does seem to be growing. The Social Mobility Foundation have just published something which has incredibly detailed, you know, analysis of the link between qualifications and pay. It just seems to me that it reproduces all the kind of inequalities of the current labour market, and embeds them. Anyway, that's my response. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eddie. We've got time for one more contribution. Vivica, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I would like to add to what you said, Eddie, as a story from Finland, or two stories, two examples from Finland. One is that when vocational schools was introduced in Finland in the early 19th century, it was part of a policy for keeping urban youth in urban areas, and for also for making rural areas more interesting for those who lived in rural areas. That is, they thought that by starting vocational schools in rural areas, they could change the labor market structure from farming to something else. And this strategy was also used in the 1970s when they started looking at vocational adult education. And they realized that there were several generations that didn't have the same kind of possibilities that those who were born in the 60s, and from that on. So they started copying England in some way. They started open universities in different parts, and they hoped for these open universities to both add to equity of possibilities, but also for changing the labor market in these areas. And Eastern Finland is one of the more successful stories in this. As I know, there have been some evaluations of that. So one way is introducing vocational education for changing labor market. And the other way is that I was part of in the 1980s, where we tried to change the streams of young people to specific jobs, the specific educations, where we looked for what was the demand on labor market in order to dimension the amount of places for different vocational programs, which wasn't so successful since once the industries got their employees, they didn't stay. That is part of the changing relationship. They weren't true to the students that had studied for employment. Instead, they left the country to some place where labor force was cheaper. So different ways of understanding how we could think of the skills we need.
Thank you very much indeed, Vivica. We're now coming up to 3 o'clock. So Ollie, I'll just hand over to you to sketch out what the next hour is going to look like.
Thanks so much, Chris, and thank you so much to our panelists for those excellent contributions. So, what we're going to do now is I'll pop everyone into breakout rooms. We found that it's quite nice for people to have a bit of time just to talk in smaller groups about what they've heard and digest that. Once you land in your breakout group, please feel free to just have a quick comfort break, 5 minutes or so, just to make yourself a cup of tea or use the bathroom. We'll be coming back together at about 3:30, and then we'll have Prue chairing our final session. Thank you, Prue, to pick up kind of questions and points from those smaller groups and put them back to our panel. So I'll press the magic button and open the breakout rooms in just a second, and feel free to land and then pop and grab a cup of tea before you join that group. Wonderful. Welcome back, everyone. Just a reminder to pop yourselves back on mute now you're in the main room, just in case of any pets or children joining you in the background. Wonderful. And I will just invite people to pop any reflections into the chat just for Prue to pick up. And I'll hand over to Prue to chair this last section of the debate. Prue.
Thanks, Ollie. Hope everyone's back in and that you've had a good time out there. We certainly had a great time in our group, thrashing a lot of ideas out, and we felt we'd had some excellent presentations, more than enough to talk about. So thank you. I think perhaps it would be really nice to hear what you were talking about in your groups, first of all. So if there's anybody ready to go from the first group, I'll be attempting to look for questions as well in the chat, but if you could pop your hand up, that would be really great. And then I can direct the question to our panel. You may have a question for a particular panel member, in which case please say, but I don't want to overload one member more than another. So questions, please, if anyone's ready to go. Or reflections on what you've been talking about in your group.
You asked group one. I'm not who is group one?
Sorry, that's a very good point. Anne-Marie, you were in group one.
Oh, good.
The labels,
excellent.
the virtual labels were not on the virtual doors. So Anne-Marie's group is group one.
Great. Anne-Marie.
I've got a list of reflections because I took some notes, but they aren't questions. They're kind of reflections. Do you want a few?
That's just absolutely. Yes, please.
Okay, we were very taken about bringing in questions about urban and rural differences, and also the notion that certainly in England we need to think about semi-rural areas, so areas that are outside big urban groupings but are affected by them, and thought that the geography of different regions is really important, including the infrastructure which affects opportunities for vocational education and training. And we had some examples of where there was collaboration actually within regions. The example of South Yorkshire, where there's some effect of collaboration going on. And it was an interesting comment made about how it tended to involve in leaning on strengths in the region, where an institution may have a particular strength, to avoid competition. So where there's overlap between what institutions do, there's often competition. And we raise the question of competition, of the challenges of creating social partnerships, when actually even educational institutions are in competition with one another and don't create partnerships. So schools and colleges and universities seeing themselves as actually competing rather than working together in regional as well as national areas. We also raised the issue about having to have some sort of cradle to grave view about education and training, so preschool and early years, and then thinking about higher levels, level 4 and so on, where we tend to get focused in on levels 1 and 2 in particular. And we also, and how that sort of provision can work, and how colleges and their provision fit within that. And then we did point that, picked up the point that so many, about half of young people in colleges haven't achieved a so-called pass grade at English and maths, and that kind of points to well, a large number of the cohort that are participating, and that hidden behind that are questions about disadvantages of social class and race and gender and migration that hide behind that achievement data. Right, I'll stop there.
Oh, wow, thank you, Anne-Marie, for a great summary there. I'd like to just ask the panel for some reflection on that. I think the semi-rural, and perhaps Kevin, because you were very much focusing on your area, but within the Greater Manchester area, you were pointing out the differences. And have you any thoughts on the issue of the semi-rural locations and collaboration there?
Well, absolutely. In Greater Manchester, anybody who doesn't know Greater Manchester, it does have many semi-rural areas which have very different issues than you know the city of Manchester itself, not least the lack of decent transport. So I think that the question of how local is an important one, the one that we discussed within our breakout group, and therefore I do think that the kind of scale that was being talked about, for example, with the combined authorities for somewhere like Manchester, is truly huge, really. And in terms of being a local solution, it may feel local if you live in Manchester, in the centre of Manchester. It won't feel local if you live in the outskirts, and somewhere like Shaw, for example, which is semi-rural. So I think that question is an important one. And I think it's in our group, we picked up the point that Leslie was making around voice. So who has a say, and how is that say heard at the local level? And also realizing that there are necessary tensions, that some things are better organized at a regional or national level, whether it's the delivery of certain resources, for example, and some things are better, might be better at a very local level. And there are necessary tensions there. There will be arguments. And I suppose somewhere like Manchester, ultimately, those arguments can be answered this way. More people live in more densely populated areas, are likely to have a louder voice than places like Shaw, which is less densely occupied, rightly or wrongly. That is a way of looking at local democracy. There are more voters live in urban areas.
Yes. Thank you very much for that. I'd like to link in a point there that you mentioned, and also we'll ask Norman about this because it's something that he raised in our group, but obviously Norman presented to us all together as well. And that was the issue about local versus national when you're looking at particular provision, if that's provision for the pre-19 group or for post-19. And I think you made some very interesting contributions there, Norman. I wonder if you'd just like to sort of reflect on that for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think as Kevin just said, we shouldn't think that there's a perfect system, that everybody's going to get every opportunity that they want for all time. Once we take out the sort of ideal skills scenario, we're then at the level of real people wanting real things. So I think, and I really take seriously what Leslie had said, because I think that's a really good check on what sort of, and I will say a mediating system, but what sort of system will enable everybody to do and participate in what they can. And so therefore that question of voice and ownership of opportunities is incredibly important. So we need that check-in somewhere. But in regards to the locality, I think it's important that we also realise that if we have local ownership of something, we understand the locality, we understand what it offers, what its affordances are, but we also understand what it isn't and what it doesn't give us. So if we're not near the coast, we're not anticipating to be a sailor. We're not really. We might want to be, and we can go somewhere to do something about it. But in terms of real opportunities and real access to the labour market, then we need to begin where we are. And that is to ensure that we have, and I use the word regional entitlement, but I think we have an entitlement in terms of our locality to access the affordances around us in a way, I did mention this about universities as well, but I do think there's an entitlement that colleges should be able to supply to enable us to access the labour market realistically. So the choice then becomes, I can access the labour market realistically, with real endeavour if I wish to, or I can choose a different route and be slightly harder, but that's what I really want to do. Those decisions, I think, need to be sifted through and worked through. And I hope that sort of answered the question, Prue, that you were directing me towards. But I'm not saying there's an answer. What I'm saying is we should think of who's talking to who about what, and it should certainly be the local community at some level that has purchase on that. And I would actually include that rural dimension as well. I don't think it's a utilitarian policy machine that we should engage in. I think we should have the checks and balances that take us down to a truly democratic level without losing the sight of the realistic opportunities that local business and the local economy is supplying.
Yeah, well,
The only thing I'd add through when I was through for May, the only thing I was adding, I think, is I accept that's really Norman's conception there, and I think that makes a lot of sense. But I do make the distinction between pre-19 and post-19. I think pre-19 is the risk place becoming destiny without choice. So a young person is in a place and has their future determined by their local education offer, rather than making that choice later in life when someone has more agency, age 19 and above, then the place that they're living is a greater degree of choice. So the place doesn't need to be destiny in quite the same way. So I'd want a wide offer for young people 16 to 18 to be provided, which is related to the local labour market, but not determined entirely by the local labour market, which is different to an adult who, as I say, makes the active choice to stay in a particular area and to either pursue their educational goals and work goals in that area, or moves away in order to access other opportunities.
Mm. Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I think that really brought the 2 points together very, very nicely for me and what we were discussing, and particularly in terms of the pre-19, to at least have a realistic offer and not to pretend to young people because you do this program, you will gain employment in that sector. And that seems to me one of the unfortunate things that's happened for many, many years now in terms of courses being offered without being clear. Well, you may be interested, but there isn't that opportunity around here, probably. Maybe you need to look wider, but it shouldn't restrict what you can access. So I think that's a really important point to be made there. So perhaps we could ask the next group. I know we didn't have numbers, but not the group in which I was, and not Anne-Marie.
The group that Kevin was in is probably the easiest way of saying it.
We've probably got 2 other groups. I think we had 4 groups in all. So someone from either group 2 or 4, if such things exist. Could somebody else perhaps reflect on what they've been talking about?
Well, I mean, I can if you like. I mean, I will. These are obviously my reflections. As I say, we were talking. Leslie had raised the question of voice and the kind of ethical questions that involves, and also technical questions as to how do you hear the voice? How is the voice translated into anything, into some kind of action? We were also talking about the informal economy, which obviously is quite different in South Africa, but nevertheless, many young people work in precarious jobs, even in this country, in the great cities in which many of us live. Many young people have precarious jobs, and so that is something which I think is significant for us to understand as well. And this question that we were talking about the relationship between a national entitlement, which is, to pick up Martin's point, might well be up till the age of 19. And what that might mean for post-19 is something that we also discussed. I raised the question that was posed by the Nuffield review, which I think I'm right in saying is what does an educated 19-year-old look like today? Which I think is a reasonable question for us all to pose and to have different answers to, and to have a discussion as to whether that educated 19-year-old might look slightly different or have slightly different knowledge living in different parts of the country, going back to the idea of composition. When I posed the question to Leslie as to how that voice might be mediated, her response was around adult education and the role of adult educators. And I think, if I may, just to perhaps something which was raised earlier on by Norman, the importance of mediating or anchor institutions. And I think there is, within the English context, I think there is a very important role for further education colleges. Above all, because further education colleges exist. They don't have to be invented. They do exist in towns and cities. They are, broadly speaking, known by the population. They are, broadly speaking, trusted. They have local interests in a way that many universities, for example, don't. The term local, as Holly Henderson's work has shown us, the term local in relation to universities is dismissive. Universities want to be global, whereas colleges have got that kind of local responsibility, I suppose. So I think that looking for how we might move towards a more local system, I do think colleges, at least in the English context, have got a very important role to play.
Yeah. We did raise that point in our group as well, Kevin, the fact that some universities certainly did have a local regional focus because they recruited very heavily from students who were living in that area. And this was very much in contrast with other institutions who recruit mainly international students. Probably my own institution would figure there. So there are very different perceptions of these institutions and how keen they might be to engage with their local communities because they provide their undergraduates and so on. So it's a very important point there. We did raise a point in our group about adults and some of the issues there, which are enmeshed in all kinds of funding difficulties and calculations, that there are adults who would clearly like to access programs, but those programs may not be funded, or they may have to do a particular type of program which is not suitable for their needs and so on. And we would like to see more flexibility there in terms of what is on offer for adults and the ways in which those programs are funded, because this is quite a constraining factor for colleges who would have the capacity to offer things, but they don't always have the funding available to provide those programs. Now, I ought to ask the other group, the final group, if you have any particular reflections. Is there anyone from that group who would like to ask anything of the panel?
There were just three groups.
Oh,
Bruce, so
well, that was it.
It would be your
right.
own group, if there's anyone else who wanted to come in.
Yes, right. So if anybody else would like to raise any questions of our panel members, please feel free to do so. I see Anne-Marie's posted something in the chat here. It's talking about a young person who definitely wanted to stay local and found a program to make this possible. Perhaps you'd like to enlarge on that a bit, Anne-Marie. I think you're on mute.
Right, I've unmuted myself now. I really agree with the idea that you don't want to close down people's opportunities, particularly young people's opportunities, too soon. But there's a real pressure, I think, on young people and on adults as well, that we should be mobile, that we should want to move, and that we should be prepared to move around. And that's not necessarily what people want to do. And that particular example was from a study that I did where a young person was very clear that she didn't want to move, and she therefore was very specific in choosing her education and training program to make sure that she could stay local. As she put it, it's either part-time work in the local supermarket for the rest of my life on 0 hours contracts, or taking this one particular program and not choosing any other job if I want to stay local. And I think colleges, that's part of what we've been discussing, is that whole issue about what's the value of local, and what does local mean for different people. But it's quite a challenge because we're constantly pushed, colleges included, never mind higher education institutions, to think bigger, to think everyone wants to get away. Nobody wants to stay in that place, whether it's a bus service or whatever. And actually, that's not necessarily the case. People are often invested for all sorts of reasons and have reasons to value the places that they come from and want to be in. So, so part of my point was saying the labour market is also, obviously, it's not something was part of our discussion today, but you have got to then think, what's the labour market conditions that are available within particular areas, rural, semi-rural, and urban, as well as bigger than that.
Yes, absolutely. The point's very well made. And there are also people who don't wish to leave their area to study at all. I mean, we know from our work with our own colleges that it's quite difficult to get people to come into Birmingham city centre, to the main campus, because people would prefer to access something in a local place, local community centre, church hall, whatever. Coming into the city centre is quite a big step. So I think we need to be careful by talking, that the sort of mini local and regional, and that's a big step for many people to actually travel to the city centre to access a programme. I see we've got Chris and Martin with hands up. So Chris, could we come to you first, please?
Yeah, very, very briefly. I just wanted to raise the issue of capacity, the ability of local and regional authorities to actually do the research and the planning and the coordination that needs to be done to develop effective local policies. And my thought is that with the cuts to local government funding over the past decade or so, that capacity has been dangerously eroded, so that even if we wanted regional and local authorities to play a greater role, it might be beyond their compass at this stage.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chris. Martin?
Very similar point to Chris, in effect, is around capacity. Leslie laid out a system of co-production, which was very interesting, and Norman talked about mediation. But it's the capacity to have those mediations and actually that co-production, but also at pace and a rapidly changing economy, how you can change curriculum and provision and the mix sufficiently quickly when you're engaged in co-production with multiple social partners. I can see how this works well in Germany with a more stable manufacturing-led economy. But if you're in a service-led economy, then I think there are constraints that apply here. And I don't know that local authorities are able to have the capacity to use the data and the information in a way in which will be sufficiently of pace in order to allow for delivery in a timely way.
Absolutely, or even colleges to be able to do it, to have the resource. I know some considerable time ago, we closed certain engineering workshops and converted them to hair and beauty salon. Currently, they're being transformed again, and hair and beauty is now off because there's a much bigger local provider. But engineering and work coming through rail track network rail and all of that has changed what we're going to offer. But these things take a lot of money to offer, and you can't always jump around that quickly. So there's always a lag time. And so the point is well made, Martin, is it within our capacity or our resource to be as quick as we can be always? And is it desirable? I think there's a very interesting point that Eddie's put in the chat here, that valuing the local can also be about staying connected, that you can therefore provide support networks that make it possible to study and or work. Yes, and I think we shouldn't underestimate the significance of alumni and, you know, local people coming into college, talking to students, running things, hosting work experience placements and so on. So I think the point there is very well made. Christina, yes. Lovely question. Is there a happy equilibrium between national and local? Oh, shall we throw that one open to the panel? Who'd like to pick on that one? Is there an equilibrium between national and local? Anyone on the panel happy to take that one up?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah,
yes.
I'm just eager to answer that in the positive, because of course one of the things, and I think that in response to Martin, I'm not quite sure we would agree that we are going to stay in the same system. The whole, my premise is that we haven't established a fully coherent system yet in vocational education and training with links to labour market opportunities. And if we haven't done that, I think the question is, yes, we should do it. And then the question is what should it look like? It should look like one where people agree to find a solution to the problems it has. And that is, so the happy equilibrium is that we get the right parties making agreements, finding consensus over that have sustainable relationships. So it's not about a quick fix or that it must respond to the market immediately. It's about taking market interests into consideration, college capacities, workforce capacity, and the wider community. The aim is to reach a consensus around mediating agreements rather than thinking that one's got to trump the other. So horrible answer, but is that our purpose, that we want to have a coherent system or not?
Yeah, terrific answer, Dawn, thank you. Something that I read only this morning, which was written in the 1980s. I can't remember the author now, that's very bad of me, sorry about that. But it was saying that there's so many parties interested in colleges and what they're doing that in fact nobody is ever going to be satisfied, because they were quoting 6 or 7 parties that had an influence, and you know, nothing was ever right. But I think we do have to move on from that by just accepting, well, it's never going to be right. And you know, you're right in saying there's got to be some longer term consensus rather than what's in flavour this year and what's gone out of flavour. So thank you very much for that. Right, there's a question here about anchor institutions. We're probably nearing our time, aren't we? This is again Anne-Marie saying, you know, the mediating role of colleges and the ways in which some of the examples we've given link to that mediating role. And are colleges in a strong enough position to manage all of that and manage those tensions? I mean, Norman, do you have a view on that one as representing colleges?
Well, only quickly, just that I think that we following the sort of paper that Chris and I did with Mark about setting out the problems was, some colleges are incredibly reflective and wanted to respond to those conditions, and we're seeking to try to look at what can you do if you're a college currently with those pressures. And I think the first thing to do, and I don't think it's easy, or even would you dare take the challenge, but you have to rethink what you understand by anchor institution, because you can't just say we're an anchor institution. You have to then have a new civic purpose, and that's in a current climate where we've seen, where there are industrial tensions and there are all sorts of pressures. But I think if we want to go further, then the aim would have to be that colleges begin at least to entertain the idea that they have to do things that isn't simply, and this is so hard, but following the money. They have to look at their communities and see how are they reaching into their community without it being an add-on, but being a part of their fundamental purpose.
Absolutely, yeah.
Absolutely, and perhaps if I could just come in there, yeah. I think that the local arrangement of the adult education budget, for example, that has the potential to allow colleges to do precisely that. It's not necessarily going to happen, but it has the potential for that to free colleges from, as you say, Norman, chasing the money from contradictory sources. So I think that there are mechanisms that can bring about that kind of change. I realize Viveka has had her hand for a while.
Sorry. Yes, I did too. Yes, Viveka. Sorry.
Problem. I didn't. My answer or my comment isn't related to that. It's rather related to what the suggestions we got in Sweden and Finland from the European Union once they evaluated the vocational educations here in the 1980s was to go to another system that is the kind of a German. But it wasn't so easy to change, since the traditional financiation of vocational education, it also builds on traditions. And in Germany, there are other organizations from the companies and from the vocational organizations. They have the responsibility for vocational education, which changes their role and their responsibilities towards vocational education. Whereas in Sweden and Finland, when we changed, there wasn't such an organization. So it was you could say, top-down steering of industries, which wouldn't actually happen. Why would they do something they hadn't done before, and why would they contribute to that one? So this borrowing and lending in terms of models is not an easy thing. It's not a way. It will eventually, when it settles, it will be a local version, but not the original. And we are both in Sweden and Finland, we are trying to solve problems with trying to implement the German model that didn't work the way we thought. So I think you two have traditions you have to look at in England, in the UK. And traditions are, well, they're sticky. So people won't do things they are not expected to do and not familiar with. These changes are slow, and they have to find new ways and new solutions.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, thank you very much for reminding me. I think Germany is also not without its own problems now in terms of vet there. So thank you very much for reminding us. We are coming close to the end, and I know that I just want to say that we haven't given Leslie an opportunity to come in here. But there have been messages in the chat about how useful your presentation was, and perhaps we have neglected, not just neglected you, but also all the informal learning that goes on, and of course the informal economy. And you said many young people in South Africa, of course, have precarious jobs or are unemployed or precarious. I think we also need to be mindful that many adults in the UK, United Kingdom, have precarious jobs. They may also be well paid precarious jobs, others are less so. But precarity is a big feature as well. So I wanted to thank you, Leslie, for your contribution, because it caused us to think more about the whole nation of informal working, informal learning, and precarious employment. So thank you very much for that, Leslie. I think now that finishes our panel time, and I have to thank everybody who's offered so much for us this afternoon, our speakers, but also the people in the groups as well, and for this lively discussion. So I think it's time now to hand over to Chris, who's just going to say a final few words.
Thank you very much indeed, Prue. I will just say a few words. They are my own take. I don't intend them to be comprehensive in any way. Before we had this seminar, I understood this issue was a very complex one. I certainly haven't changed my view about that, having listened to the discussion. So just a few points that have occurred to me. And the first is a very big one, I think. It's what are the proper boundaries between national, local, and regional policy. And I think the national level of policy making is really important in the sense that it sets the framework for any kind of regional or local collaboration that's likely to take place. And this came over perhaps most clearly in the discussions about the affordances for institutions to collaborate in an environment that is more geared towards competition, both between institutions and for governmental funding. So that issue of the national framework is extremely important, I think. And it also relates to a point that, that Kevin made very early on in his presentation about skills equilibria and the fact that some localities are locked into a low skill equilibrium. Now, that is partly an issue to do with national policy, I think, about encouraging employer demand for higher skills, but it's also a local issue as well. What can local institutions and authorities with their local knowledge and their limited local resources do to make changes there? So that again is a question of division of labor, and in particular, local areas have got local knowledge, local relationships to offer. And in our breakout group discussion, the question was raised as to the extent to which nationally offered qualifications, which are important for occupational labour markets, can actually be adjusted or tweaked in various ways to take account of local labour market needs or local needs more generally. So that's a very important issue, and closely related to it, I think, are the points made about adult provision, retraining, and the importance of informal economies, which I think we've tended to ignore, but I suspect are rather important in the British context. The other closely related issue is the sheer diversity of national needs. Martin mentioned the crowded nature of the English polity, but though very crowded, it's also very diverse, and the issue of semi-rural and rural areas was raised, how these fit into a broader urban picture, what are the dangers of marginalization for areas which, as it were, fall between geographical stools. I think that's an issue that requires careful consideration. And the final point I wanted to raise, which I don't really think we have made much progress with, but maybe we need to revisit, is the issue of governance of anchor institutions. There is the issue of what we understand by them, obviously, but how should they be governed? How should governing bodies be composed, for example. And we need not just to consider the governance of individual institutions, but the, if you like, a more regionalized governance. If we are serious about collaboration between institutions, how is that to be managed as well? Those were my thoughts, Ollie.
Chris, as ever, incredibly impressive, condensing after 2 hours of really rich discussion. I just wanted to finish by saying a huge thank you to everyone, to our panelists, to Chris and Prue for chairing the two halves of the session, to everyone for contributing. We'll write up this session as a short article and share the video as well, and I'll send that around to everyone. And then we'll be writing it up into one of our reports that feeds into the kind of wider debate here as well. So huge thank you for your brain power over the last couple of hours. It's a pleasure to spend this time with you, and we hope you have a really good rest of the day. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ollie.
Thank you, thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.